Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. The human brain is full of mysteries, and to unravel it we have experts like neurologist Dr. Guy Leschziner. His most recent book, 7 Deadly Sins, The Biology of Being Human, tells us what is going on in our brains when we behave the way we do. How much of our actions are shaped by biology as opposed to our experience. And you don't need a degree in medicine to understand his work. Thanks so much, Dr. Guy, for agreeing to chat with me.
It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. And I sincerely hope I have pronounced your last name to the best of my ability. I might not be the first person. Have I done that right? Or
No, but I've long ago given up correcting people because it's such a difficult name.
How would you say it?
I would say Leschziner, but I respond to a variety of pronunciations.
Thank you. And when you had that option of responding to a variety of professions, you chose what you did. You are a neurologist. I was curious to know, most of us either stumble into our careers. Some know what they want to as early as age 5. A few others rely on their friends or parents' judgment to, let's see what happens. And sometimes it's an accident. What was it for you?
Yeah, I was one of those fortunate individuals that realised very early on in life what I wanted to do. And, one of the reasons why I have gone into writing books is because these books were really what embarked or triggered my future career. I remember reading books like Oliver Sacks as a schoolboy and being absolutely fascinated by how essentially this kilo or so of fatty tissue defined everything about what it means to be human, from how we experience the world, our thoughts, our behaviours, how we act. It was remarkable. And, although we understand still relatively little about how this organ works, we understood even less at the time that I was reading these books in the 80s and early 90s.
So you always wanted to write. Is that what it was? You wanted to write about this subject as such, or?
No, not at all. I wanted to see patients and to understand the workings of the brain. Actually, writing came to me very late on. I had never intended to write a single word, or at least not for the non-medical community, but it was something that happened by serendipity, really.
And for somebody who didn't plan on writing, your book has given me one big lesson. And one biggest takeaway is don't judge a person by his actions, because we have no idea what causes the person to act in that manner. And this comes very early in your book, where you describe a man in his 40s who goes on a rampage in terms of ripping everything apart in a hospital because he's had a seizure, and then he goes on to lead a normal life as a split personality of sorts. The human brain can be so overbearing on an individual that he seems normal one moment and absolutely ridiculous the next. What are such examples that even baffled you when you started out?
Yeah, so, the origins of many of the patients in this book are the experiences that I have in my neurology clinic. So we very frequently see individuals who, as a result of brain damage or brain dysfunction, act in ways that are perhaps not representative of their underlying personality, of who they are as human beings, of the core of their beings. So the example that you give of a man who is incredibly violent in the context of his is a very typical one. But we also see individuals who have dramatic responses to medications that might be given for certain conditions. So individuals, for example, who have been started on a group of drugs called the dopamine receptor agonists, which are used in the context of Parkinson's disease, who exhibit very marked changes in their sexual behaviour. So either hypersexuality or in terms of actually completely altering their sexual preference. So these are very good examples. In the course of my own clinical practice, I frequently see individuals who have been accused of crimes as a result of sleepwalking. So, whilst sleepwalking is not necessarily seen as a brain disorder, it really illustrates the fact that during these sleepwalking events, the brain is not working as it normally would during the day, and can result in sometimes some rather violent or otherwise damaging acts.
To illustrate this from the science perspective, or what happens in the brain. For example, we see some people who are delirious or when they get angry, and sometimes at their own peril. A normal man may not take on certain challenges, or will not take somebody on who's thrice his size, but some people might. What's happening typically in those people who tend to lose their bearings or other mind more often than others, or can we generalize it?
Well, I think there are some generalizations, but what you have to remember is that the brain is a complex organ with multiple different areas that are specialized for different purposes. And in order to act normally, all those brain regions need to work in synchrony. This is a greater machine, and all the cogs need to be working in unison in order to demonstrate normal behavior. Now, how you define normal is a entirely separate issue, but let's for argument's sake use the term normal. One of those regions is not working properly, or the connections between those different brain regions is not working normally, then that can result in marked changes of behavior. So either those areas of the brain that are the origins of particular behaviors, like eating, like lust, sexual behavior, like anger, if those are upregulated, if those are boosted, then that can result in abnormal behavior. But I talk about in the book this area of the brain which is called the prefrontal cortex, which is the region of the brain that sits basically behind our forehead, above our eyes. And I talk about this brain region as being the seat of humanity. The reason why I describe it in those terms is because this is the region of the brain that is responsible for rational thinking, for planning, for reasoning, and also for reining in antisocial behaviours, for driving pro-social behaviours. So if this area of the brain is underactive or is damaged in some way, then that can give rise to the usual brakes of those more primitive areas of the brain that drive things like sexual behaviour, hunger, thirst, these kinds of behaviours and indeed emotions. Then that brake is removed and it can be uncontrolled.
So when I'm playing badminton, say, and with a partner, and if he misses an easy shot, the urge to club him with a bat is, if I have that, and if I don't do it, that means there is some part of the brain which is stopping me from doing that. If that prefrontal cortex were damaged, I would have done that. Is that what it means?
Well, I think we've all experienced that sort of desire, but whether we act upon it or not is a function of how active our prefrontal cortex is. One of the earliest examples of that, which is somebody that I describe in the book, is a chap called Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker in the east coast of the United States who in 1848 unfortunately destroyed part of his frontal lobe because he was a little bit too eager in terms of using a tamping iron to push an explosive into a hole, and unfortunately the explosive went off and drove this very heavy metal pole through his frontal lobes. Remarkably, he survived this accident. But it was, according to medical records of the time, the transformation in his personality that was really quite remarkable as well, because before this accident he was said to be a God-fearing man who went to church, was polite to everyone, was careful with his money. And after this accident he became a whoring, swearing, gambling, unpleasant chap who was disliked thoroughly by everybody, largely because the brakes on those primitive behaviours that we all have, that all of us have residing in our brains, were removed as a result of that accident.
In India, Dr. Guy, please let me know if this falls under the same bucket. Recently, we've had this big wave of stock market addiction where teenagers and young adults are putting money in futures and options on 2 or 3 taps of the mobile phone, which previously would have been difficult. You just have to download and you've got what we call the UPI, United Payments Interface. Automatically the amount gets debited from your bank. You place a bet and there is a rush to know at the end of the day, do you make money? And that'll be 4 times. If you lose the whole principal amount. And tens of thousands of people are getting hooked to it, so much so that the finance minister had to come in and say that this could have a big impact on household finances and that you need to rein it in. So what exactly is happening among the young adults here when knowingly they put their money on the line? Some people have mortgaged their homes and not told their wives about it. And this is quite a big thing that is happening around. What part of the brain, is that the prefrontal cortex that is responsible, it doesn't have the brakes then?
Well, again, there are parallels between these kinds of addictions and other forms of addiction, including sex addiction, for example. So we know that there are circuits deep within the brain, circuits called the mesolimbic pathway, that is responsible for pleasure and reward. And that circuit is driven by a chemical called dopamine. Now, when that is repeatedly stimulated at very high levels, that can seek further risky behaviour. And, a good parallel with that is, for example, the increase in sex addiction that has probably been driven by the ease of access of things like internet pornography. We live in a much more sexualised era at the moment. And so, obviously there were significant hurdles to this kind of behaviour, but the more you stimulate the dopamine system, this mesolimbic circuit, the more you desire stimulation of that circuit. And it's that ease of access to these kinds of feedback mechanisms that give rise to the feeling of reward or pleasure that actually drive an exacerbation of these behaviours.
And can we do anything about it, or we are born with it?
Well, I think that there are certainly genetic aspects to this, in that we know that our genes influence a range of our behaviours, be it predisposition to addiction or a predisposition to anger, for example. There's very good evidence that depending on what genetic makeup we have will influence how angry and how violent we are likely to be. But some of it is, and perhaps this is why I am, although my book is, initially can be perceived as being a sort of rallying call against a moral viewpoint, a moral framework for our view of human behaviour. Actually, we know that our brains are mouldable, that they change all the time throughout our lives, and they are dramatically influenced by our environment. So by changing our environment, we can change the behaviour of society and also individuals. And I guess that, when you look at the parallels with sex addiction, for example, there are strong arguments for making these kinds of stimuli less accessible to particularly young individuals, although older individuals are also at risk of these kinds of problems.
So largely we are a product of our environment. That cliche stands true. And there may be exceptions like the ones that you cover in the book, where you may be born with certain wiring of the brain that just can't be fixed by, for example, if we tell a person to rein it in, control yourself, be patient, and if the circuits are not molded in that way, if that guy is angry because either an operation has gone wrong or that's the way he was born. So are those exceptions then? Because it'll only make them more angrier still, if you tell them to, pipe down.
I think the answer to that is both genetics and brain structure, which are things that we are born with. Brain structure changes during life and can be moulded by environment, and also environment are important, and that different individuals sit somewhere within that spectrum of nature versus nurture. So, when it comes to all of our behaviours, we know that there is a strong congenital component, a component that is present from birth, but we also know that there's a very strong environmental component in terms of the environment that we're brought up in, our parental styles, and what we're exposed to in the world. It's a function of both.
And would there be a ratio to it, or that may not be the right question to ask? For example, I can't be a guitarist at the age of 41 like Jimmy Page. Maybe I never could. Or then the argument is, no, you could if you really practice hard enough. You could, be more than what you were generally supposed to be. And there are these motivation books out there where people write without any basis, but you have that. You've studied the nervous system. How does that work, that balance between the two?
I think it varies tremendously between individuals. So there may be some people who have a genetic advantage to, for example, to use your vignette, to play the guitar. And if they practice less than somebody who does not have that genetic advantage, they may well be a superb guitarist. There are some people who perhaps don't have that genetic advantage, but will practice endlessly to the point where they actually do have that ability. So I think that it really does depend very much on an individual basis. Again and again throughout the analysis of of these kinds of behaviours that I describe, there are examples of individuals who have a very strong genetic component that overrides everything. And then there are individuals in whom the environmental factors that have influenced the function and the structure of their brains are by far the most important thing.
One such example that you give in your book is that of obesity. You write that there was a study, was it by Howard, which said that obesity spreads via social connections as well, and some of it can be separate study, I guess, can on the same count can be hardwired in the brain when the person is in the womb, when I mean you're not even born. So let's take the first part, which I thought was something that if you are around people who are obese or overweight, odds are that you too will be that.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good example that you mentioned, Abhishek. So we know that there are a number of genetic influences on our levels of obesity. Many genes, common variants in genes. We also know that in a few families there are rare genetic factors that cause people to be markedly obese from a very early age, as early as 1 year old. But those very much interact with our environment. So that study that you refer to really demonstrated that, obesity, when tracked over time, seems to parallel to a large extent your social networks. And importantly, these are not necessarily people that you live with or your neighbours. They are associated with strong social connections with individuals who you see as similar to yourself. So if, for example, you have a friend who is of the same gender as you and who you identify very closely with, regardless of whether they live next to you or live 50 miles away, you are much more likely to develop obesity. So it tells us that there is something about seeing people who you identify closely with, who you see yourself as being similar to, becoming obese, influencing your own body weight. And it's that combination of those genetic factors, those environmental factors, but also, when it comes to obesity in terms of those pleasure circuits that we talked about, the mesolimbic pathways that influence your eating behavior. So, for example, we know that food, particularly calorie-rich food, causes the release of certain chemicals within the brain, chemicals like opiates, endogenous opiates within the brain. So these are akin to morphine, for example. And so, eating can act as a salve for people who have anxiety or depression, which is why sometimes obesity is linked in some individuals with poor psychological health.
You also concede in the book that we can't always attribute obesity to laziness or lack of self-control. There could be more to it.
Yeah. So, we know that there are some really important circuits that influence how our brain monitors our body fat stores. And these are mediated particularly strongly by a chemical called leptin. So whilst we kind of think of body fat as being this inert store of energy, we actually know that body fat is an active organ and it produces hormones. One of those hormones, leptin, has a direct influence on those feeding areas of the brain, providing a feedback loop. But where our leptin thermostat is, that sort of level of leptin at which we switch from eating to not eating, varies quite significantly. Now, some of that is genetic. Some of that can even be related to what happened when we were in our mother's womb. So there is a very important study that looked at individuals who were in their mother's womb during a famous famine at the end of the Second World War in the Netherlands. And what they found was that depending on when you as a fetus were in low-calorie conditions, dramatically influenced your body weight and also your cardiovascular risk later on in life, indeed in adult life. So the environment in which you were gestating, in which you were in your mother's womb, can have a really quite dramatic influence on those circuits within the brain that mediate eating behavior.
Right. And I stumbled upon one little joke by Ricky Gervais, and I'd like to run it by you and humor me. He's essentially saying is that you didn't get fat behind your back. You put on weight, you put on a layer of fat if you take more calories than you burn. And the fat people know that, or they knew it. It's not like, somebody has induced some calories in your lettuce. And if somebody is sitting with a lot of pudding next to it, it's not if somebody says, is that what made me fat? Oh, I thought it was all the running. So Ricky Gervais is saying that, look, I don't judge fat people. It's just scientifically they could help themselves, but they don't. They help themselves with something that they shouldn't. So what part of his argument you think is jest and there is some truth to it then? Which part of it is true?
Yeah, well, look, undoubtedly, what he says is true, which is that if you consume more calories than you burn, be that through exercise or through growth or through other metabolic activity, that those calories have to go somewhere and they will be deposited in fat. I guess what I'm saying is that, that there is our appetite, how much we consume is to a greater or lesser extent, and you can argue about the degree to which this is true, influenced by the structure and the function of our brain and also our other organs. And so, both of those can be true at the same time. I don't think that they necessarily negate each other. And so if you are an individual who has the brain machinery that stimulates your appetite, then of course it's going to be much more difficult to restrict your calorie intake.
Right. And is that why you also mentioned one of your examples? I don't know if that person was your patient or you have a story of a person who is obese. Their parents know about it. She knows she can't do much about her condition. So she'll only stock the fridge with one meal before meal time. And so not that the whole fridge is stocked with the all day's meal, for example. And that is to physically, distance herself from the food so that she doesn't eat the whole thing in one go. If my memory serves me right, that's one example you give.
Yeah. So Alex, So Alex has got a very rare condition which is called Prader-Willi syndrome, which is a genetic disorder that results in the area of the brain that really drives eating behaviour and satiety, that feeling of being able to sate your hunger, to malfunction. So actually she never feels full regardless of how much she eats. And individuals with this kind of genetic disorder will often eat to the extent sometimes that can result in death. So they can, for example, perforate their stomach from eating too much because they get no signal of feeling full at all. They feel perpetual hunger. And, what that illustrates is, again, that both of these things are true. That if you restrict calories, in her case, her calorie restriction has to be undertaken by her carers and by her parents, to the extent where they actually have to lock the bins outside the house to stop her getting food from the bins. They have to lock the cupboards in the kitchen in order to prevent her from accessing food. But as a result of that, she is not obese. So I think that speaks very much to Ricky Gervais's point, that if you restrict calories, you will prevent obesity. But at the same time, it also illustrates that as a result of a very clear biological disorder, in her case a genetic disorder, that also influences her level of obesity if she was in a world that existed like we all exist in, whereby we have ready accessibility to calories pretty much everywhere we go.
And how much of that contributes to the way our brain functions? Because not too long ago, our fingers were used to carrying spears and sticks. Now we have smartphones where you can place an order. You really had to earn your bread. Now the bread comes to you within 10 minutes. In India, literally in 8 minutes, there is a concept called quick commerce. If you are...
Yep.
I'm not even joking. I'm myself surprised. I'm cooking fish, let's say, and I've run out of cloves. I can only order cloves and it'll come by the time my pan is hot. So we live in that age. So what happens to our brain? Has it evolved enough, or it's completely surprised that, hey, this is not what I was evolved to do? How does that work?
Well, I think that's a really important point, which is, human evolution has occurred over many, many generations. But, for the vast majority of human history, we were hunter-gatherers or possibly agrarians, although even that phase of our evolutionary time is relatively short compared to hunter-gatherers. So we evolved in a very different world to that we inhabit now. And there is a significant body of evidence that suggests that our genetics is really driven to allow us to survive in hunter-gatherer times rather than in the current modern world with, here we have Deliveroo and Uber Eats and all of this other technology that allows us to access extremely high calorie foods. So our genetics has really not caught up with our environment, which is perhaps one of the reasons why obesity has become so prominent in the current day and age.
And you talked about parents, Alex's parents who would physically lock the bins. What advice might you have for parents? And you would be dealing with some of those folks as well who are well intentioned, but what do they do when kids snap at them at a moment's notice, or somebody is going through that phase of eating more than they should? They ask for another bite at a public place and you have to shut them down because, it's good for the kid, but then it's a social embarrassment when people look at you that, hey, he or she is not feeding their own child when they don't have the context around it. So is that tough then?
Undoubtedly it's tough. I'm a parent as well, and I know exactly what that's like. And it is a bit of a double-edged sword because, one of the other issues that we have in today's society is of eating disorders of individuals with conditions like anorexia and bulimia. So I guess it's more about educating our children about what it means to eat healthily, and not to overeat. It's important to stress that one of the real concerns when it comes to obesity is that as we become more and more obese, we also influence that feedback mechanism on our brains. And so one of the hypotheses about why obesity becomes such a difficult problem to treat is that as you become more obese, your brain becomes increasingly resistant to those factors that then make you feel full. And so you can reach a tipping point whereby when you get to a particular point in obesity where, you're just going to descend further down that road. But it's about teaching our children, what healthy eating is, putting things like chocolate and cake on a pedestal, but making them understand that this is part of a balanced diet rather than something that they can eat without end.
And do you see the parenting styles change over time? You've had your students, you yourself were a student once upon a time, let's say 20, 30, 40 years across this, across decades. How has parenting changed, or how do you see your students react to you as opposed to when you were a student, and how you would react to your teachers, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Certainly when I was at school and university, we were very respectful to our seniors. We would never question them. We would never kind of stand up for ourselves in a way that the current generation of students certainly would not tolerate nowadays. And I think that that's very much a function of changes in parenting style, which is undoubtedly, in some respects, a very good thing. The younger generations, or at least, for example, if I look at the medical students that I teach, have much greater self-esteem than we used to have, and are much more likely to stand up for themselves in a way that we never did. But alongside those changes, there is also a risk that we are, in some cases, depending on some parenting styles, perhaps encouraging not just self-esteem, but actually, character traits like narcissism. And certainly, we do see occasionally, and I write about it in the book, that occasionally we come across certain medical students who overtly appear to have a lot of self-esteem, but actually, fail to recognize their own ability, how well they are performing, and take criticism very badly. That is something that's not self-esteem, it's narcissism. And actually there is really good evidence from some studies that have been done in the Netherlands that demonstrate clear associations between parenting style and whether or not you're engendering self-esteem or narcissism in your child.
And to quote you in the book, I like this bit, they fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. Figuratively.
That's a quote in itself, because it comes from a very famous poem by a poet called Philip Larkin. So that I'm quoting somebody else there.
Interesting. I didn't know that. But that's one thing about narcissism. And I've met not too many, but I know a couple who have this inflated sense about themselves, but they get away with things because neither has anybody told them that I think you are in a different bubble, or B, they don't really care, and that ignorance is bliss, and that even takes them ahead in life as compared to those who are diffident but good. As a, all style, no good packaging, no substance, but they do get ahead, don't they? Some of them at least.
Yeah. Yeah, and we know that there are certain occupations that are enriched for certain character traits like narcissism, surgeons, CEOs, a whole range of other occupations where actually having a degree of self-belief that perhaps is a little bit inflated is quite useful. Politicians as well, for example. And I think that this illustrates something really important, that what we describe as sins, often have some utility. There's a reason why we're all preoccupied, and all world religions are preoccupied by the sins, because these sins are ubiquitous. And the reason why they're ubiquitous is because they have evolutionary advantages that come with them. To have anger can be very, very helpful. To have a degree of pride can be very, very helpful. But I guess if those emotions or behaviours are exhibited intensely or in situations that are not appropriate to them, that's when they cause harm to either the individual or the people around them.
Yeah, and so much so that in India we have advertisements on envy, and they sell envy. One of them was I grew up to this. There is a television set from a company called Onida, and the most popular ad, any millennial, I'm 41. If you ask my generation, they will know the tagline of this television set, and it was "Neighbors envy, owners pride." That was the tagline, and you need to get this TV set in your house, because that's what it is. And it sold. It sold in everybody had that particular TV in their house. So companies also feast or make merry on these emotions, because that's our brain craves for them. Is that one way of looking at it?
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to envy, envy is everywhere. We see it all over social media. I'm envious of this, I'm envious of that. And, envy can have some positive connotations as well. If you look at the old religious prescription, so obviously although I'm not Christian, I grew up in a Christian country. And, pride was listed as the utmost of the sins that you could exhibit, whereas pride now has a very different connotation. If you look on Twitter or Instagram or LinkedIn, you will see everywhere, I'm proud to say this, I'm proud of my community, I'm proud of X, Y, and Z. And so the meaning has changed perhaps to reflect the fact that we appreciate that sometimes these have positive outcomes in certain settings.
This can be miraculously, at least for the layperson, not somebody who's in the trade like you, it can be explained through brain scans, which I found was fascinating. You could actually put simple, without any invasive things going on in your skull, you could place certain electrodes, and can you please help us? What can one know? The other day I had a full body test. So they put me on a treadmill. There was blood test, stool test, urine test, and it tells me my cholesterol level, my blood, all of those things. But if companies, or if I were to go and find out what is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how am I in terms of anger, envy, greed, can that theoretically be found out?
Well, I think that it's important to stress that most of these studies have been done on groups of individuals rather than a single individual. Certainly there are a variety of different ways of looking at the brain. The classical way of looking at the brain is MRI, which is, a structural imaging. It tells us about the structure of the brain, the volume of the brain. And certainly if you look at groups of people who, for example, have high anger versus low anger, or high pride versus low pride, you can see differences between groups in terms of the volume of certain regions of the brain. You can also do something called functional MRI. Now, functional MRI looks at blood flow within particular areas of the brain under particular circumstances, and that helps you identify differences in individuals, for example, when they're feeling pride or when they're not feeling pride. We can also use electrical tests, so looking at the EEG, those electrodes that you referred to, that demonstrate certain signals that allow us to analyze certain neurological features in individuals. But that those are to look at differences in groups. It's very difficult to do a brain scan on you and say, oh, look, your pride center is much bigger than your friends, and therefore you are much more likely to exhibit pride.
And so if that is difficult, what might explain this bit? There's this story that we were brought up on Aesop's fables, and the scorpion and the frog. The scorpion wants to cross the river. The frog says, no, you'll sting me. The scorpion says, no, you take me on my back because I won't sting you because both of us will drown. And while they are midway, the scorpion does exactly that. It stings the frog, and the frog says, hey, we are both going to drown now. Why did you do that? He says, it isn't my nature to sting, so I stung you. I couldn't help it, but I did sting you. Now, again, going back to your original point about nature, nurture, and there is a very good line in your book where you say that our brains are molded by the two hands of nature and nurture. If I were to generate empathy in me about some other individual who may behave in an unreasonable way, how should I look at the whole thing so that your book, what you've said helps me be a better individual? And how much is it between the two?
Yeah, so I must admit that, even when I come across somebody who is deeply annoying or unreasonable, think something unspeakable that I can't repeat on this podcast, and that is human nature, to take people as they are. But I guess, what I'm trying to get across in this book is that there are a variety of factors for all of us, for every single one of us, that are not within our control, that can be things that we are born with, things that we are exposed to, drugs, disease, dysfunction, that can influence how we act. And if they are outside of our control, then it means that perhaps, many of us, or some of us, or a few of us don't have entirely free will when it comes to how we behave. So it's really a plea for understanding what those factors are, and, as you say, not judge a book by its cover necessarily. It's also important to understand those factors that are within our control, and in this context I don't mean within the control of the individual, I mean within the control of wider society, because unless we understand these more general factors that influence all of us, then we as a society have very little influence about how we as individuals behave. And without knowledge of these factors, we certainly can't change it.
How many people do you think know that somebody may be chronically ill, and that's the reason why they are behaving in this way? And even if they did, they have to operate in a system where, you can't just get away by abusing your boss, even if the boss knows that he means well, that subordinate means well. But could there be different rules for them, because they too have to feed their family? But is it down to the individual or the organizations? Have you seen society making a shift, with the knowledge of these things now that it's out there, with, experts like you putting it out as well?
Yeah. So, look, I think a really good example of that is, many years ago, I was asked to assess a patient. Well, actually, he wasn't a patient. He was about to be deported from the UK because he had been convicted of 97 crimes. And actually, the lawyers all felt that he should be deported. But what was very clear was that actually when he came to the UK, he was a respected family man who set up his own business. And during the course of this business, he was in a racist incident and sustained very significant damage to his frontal lobes. And it was after this damage that his behaviour became a little bit more criminalised. Now, it's not up to doctors to enforce the law, but what it is up to doctors is to demonstrate, or at least to try and understand why people behave the way that they do. So sometimes the law is separate from medicine, and the law is put together. The laws of man are not the laws of biology, and sometimes those are in conflict. That's really for our society to try and ascertain at what point should adaptations be made for certain individuals rather than others. And I guess that those are questions about what is the best for society as a whole rather than for that individual. My view is very much that, when it comes to things like the law, is that what we should be focusing on is whether or not the brain of somebody who acts in a way that is against the common good can be fixed or not. And, whether that brain can be moulded to an extent where their behaviour can be modulated, can be improved for the greater good. And we should be deciding if that is not the case, if the brain of that particular individual is beyond all hope, then we as a society have a responsibility to protect society from that individual. But if that brain can be moulded, and there is a reasonable chance that that brain can be moulded in a way that can improve behaviour and can prevent those behaviours from recurring, then we should look at that individual in a slightly different way.
And who decides that the brain can be molded? It's a combination of family and doctors then. I'm assuming that a doctor would probably prescribe medicines to see if certain things in the brain might, the chemical composition might change. Is that how it is? Because somebody has to decide that for the lawyers or for the law, rather.
Yeah, and I think that at the moment that remains a somewhat difficult thing to do. But I think that as our knowledge, I started off by saying that we still know relatively little about the brain. But as our knowledge of the brain, of our knowledge of what we currently term psychiatry and psychology, but, from my perspective, I'm not sure there is much difference between psychology or psychiatry and neurology. But as our knowledge in these areas improves, I think we will hopefully be in a much better situation to try and make more accurate predictions as to whether or not an individual's brain can be changed for the better. But, at the moment, there is a big question about who is the best judge. Is it the court? Is it the physician? Is it the psychiatrist? Is it the priest? Is it the philosopher? I don't know at the moment.
Yeah, you give an example which I found was interesting is the gene sequencing. You talk about, was it the warrior's gene, which is responsible for extreme anger, and that lawyers have used, please help me out here, they've planted that in the suspect so that they could reduce their sentences from death penalty to whatever, life. That is mind-boggling, where you can use this to the detriment of society if you want to then.
Yeah, and I think that, again, this runs somewhat contrary to my view about whether or not somebody's brain is fixable or not. So there is a gene called MAOA, which regulates how our brains process neurotransmitters like serotonin and adrenaline, which are, important neurotransmitters in the generation of strong emotions like anger. And there are certain families who have genetic mutations in this gene that results in all of the members of that family who carry that mutation having very, very high rates of anger and violence. A syndrome called Brunner syndrome. But actually, we now understand that there are more common variants in that gene that to some extent influence how aggressive we all are. And there have been cases in multiple countries whereby the defendants' lawyers have utilised their genetic sequence in order to mitigate against sentencing and have got a lower sentence. Now, from my perspective, as I said, that runs a little bit counter to my view, which is the question is not how much responsibility does a person have. The issue is, can that individual be prevented from causing further harm to society, further harm to themselves? And I think that there will be over the next, I'd like to imagine 20 years, but I suspect probably 50 or 100 years, whereby, medicine and the legal system are playing catch up with each other.
And last couple of questions, Dr. Guy. You've synthesized all of this and given it a theme of 7 deadly sins, explaining how the mind and the brain might work. When did you get the idea to do this, to put out a book which is understandable by the layperson without having any background in the subject? And when did you start piecing this together? And you took a leave to write the book, which you hadn't for the past 2 books that you did. So when did this all start?
Yeah, it started a few years ago. I've always been fascinated, as I said, by how the brain defines who we are. And, certainly seeing patients in clinic in whom neurological diseases have influenced how they behave and what they do has been at the core of neurology for the past 100 or 200 years. So talking about envy, pathological envy was a feature of the very first patient ever described with Alzheimer's disease by Alois Alzheimer. So we've been aware of the fact that our brain structure and function influences these kinds of behaviours. When looking for a structure, having been brought up in a Christian country, I utilise the structure of the 7 deadly sins, but could probably have written this in any other country under any other religion that is also classifying sins into certain categories, to really try and illustrate the various ways in which brain structure and function causes us to behave badly, both for individuals with diseases or disorders, but also perhaps more importantly for all of us, because the joy of medicine, the joy of neurology in particular, is that we study people at the extremes of the human experience. Individuals who have got diseases or disorders that really demonstrate them to have changes that really set them aside as outliers. But by knowing what happens when the system is broken, we understand how the system itself works, and that has repercussions in terms of understanding the brains of normal individuals and basically of us all.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dr. Guy, for joining me on the podcast, and congratulations yet again on the book. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much for chatting.
Thank you.